Lindsay. Hi, ladies and gentlemen. The recording's in progress. Great to have you at today's Thought Leadership Learning Series, the 3 R's of Reconciliation. My name is Kelly Lindsay, President and CEO of Indigenous Works, and it's great to be joining you today along with Mandy Price, Nicole Huska, our National Director of Member Relations, and Paula Sawyer from our office in Saskatoon, our Leadership Circle Member Coordinator. This is an important month with reconciliation, and we're seeing a lot in terms of what can be done. And today, in the Globe and Mail, in the business section, is an article where we got some good profile from the Globe on an article entitled "What Reconciliation at Work Looks Like." So take a look. It's a picture and a story about this important area of economic reconciliation and what can reconciliation look like in our workplaces. So very appropriate that came out at the same time as Mandy's going to be talking about the 3 R's of reconciliation. And at the end of this webinar, you're going to see a slide again promoting the webinar for the 29th and encourage you to join that. The other news is we've had such tremendous response to these knowledge series is that we're developing another series that will be offered mid-month. So watch, you're going to hear more about that. We're basically doubling down on the amount of knowledge capital that we're going to bring to you. So we'll be offering these mid-month. The month-end ones in our thought leadership are still free to our leadership circle members. And it's a way to build your knowledge capital, which is going to inform on your strategies and practices. So with that, I'm really pleased that our associate, Mandy Price, our trainer extraordinaire, who's been delivering so many amazing webinars and conducting some research in some new areas for our members, is here today to take you through the 3 R's of reconciliation. Mandy, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Mandy Price. I am a training and consultant associate with Indigenous Works. I am a Anishinaabe Kwe. I belong to the Red Rock Indian Band, signatories to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. A little bit about myself. I am a member of the Eagle Clan. I am a first generation, both residential school and day school survivor in my family. I currently hold an MBA from Western Governors University. I am currently working on my PhD in business management and leadership with a focus on Indigenous peoples in North America. That being said, I'd like to start this webinar by honoring traditional territory. Ordinarily, as mentioned, I do work from my home base, Red Rock Indian Band, Lake Helen Reserve, who are signatories to the Robinson Superior Treaty of 1850. But as mentioned, I am currently working on my PhD, so I am speaking to you this afternoon from the lands of the Choctaw Nation on the Oklahoma-Texas border. I would also like to acknowledge Canada as the land of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and I recognize this land that is shared through historic treaties, developed through contemporary treaties, and land that continues to be unceded territory today. Next slide, Subash. A little bit about Indigenous Works. We came out of the recommendation in the 1996 report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, so RCAP. Our mandate is to increase Indigenous engagement in the Canadian economy. We are an award-winning ISO certified national Indigenous organization with expertise in workplace employment, corporate Indigenous engagement, and partnership systems. 2015, we launched the Kachita charity, the mandate to increasing the human resource and career potential of Indigenous youth, including youth with disabilities, as well as our Luminary project with focus on advancing Indigenous innovation. Today's webinar is going to explore reconciliation through the lens of the 3 R's: recognition, respect, and relationships. Found a video that I would like to kick off this webinar that's going to kind of set the tone for the entire webinar today. It's a message from Senator Murray Sinclair.
Hi, I'm not sure if it's just me, but I have no audio on the video.
No audio here either.
Hey, Sebastian, when you share screen, you're gonna have to click share audio in the bottom corner.
Shall I continue on that, or we can just send the videos later? Okay.
I have 3 videos in the presentation.
Yeah. So what we'll do is we will send the videos after the presentation.
Well,
Otherwise, if you know nobody can hear, I'm trying to see the original message here, but I can't
actually,
see.
then reshare the screen. There's an option, select include audio. Okay, we got a message from Lee.
Yeah, so if you stop sharing your screen, Subhash,
Yeah.
and then when you reshare, when you click share screen, there'll be in the bottom left corner share sound that you need to click on.
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's do this, folks. Let's set it up because Mandy does have 3 videos. So let's close it down, restart it, and like she's on the bottom, I think it says include sound and optimize video. I think there's an icon there. So, folks, just while we do this technology, thank you, by the way, Lee. What a great example of just-in-time learning and support. So we'll give this a try. One of the things that while we're loading this is when we get media articles, we're looking at ways to try and reach new sectors of the economy, but you can also repurpose some of these articles and share them internally with your teams. I only got
Kelly, can you speak?
yeah.
Okay. So
background noise there. Good. Okay.
So now let's share the screen and see.
I see my friend Jim Dewald from University of Calgary, our dean. Welcome on board with his cup of coffee. It goes to show you that even the professor wants to continue his learning curve. Great to have. I mean, it is a good example, Jim, of not just managers and students, but great for being on board. A lot of background noise coming through my system here. Okay.
Can you hear?
No, Subhash, I'm going to leave the room and come back, and then the sound will work through mine. I'm going to join through a different computer.
Okay, let's do that because this is the reason. Okay, so I'm stopping this again, Kelly, and
Good.
yeah, I have to now go to the slide.
I think while we're waiting for this to be loaded with Mandy and Subash, on the reconciliation, what's interesting is people are looking for, again, their reconciliation strategies. How do we adopt truth and reconciliation? So on the 29th, our chair of our board, Pat Baxter, is going to be conducting a panel. And we've got Dr. Michael DeGagne, who's the president of Inspire, joining another Indigenous leader. And together they're going to be talking about approaches and responses to reconciliation. It's going to be more like a fireside chat with some really interesting insights and perspectives that I think will find very, very helpful. Someone's got their, maybe make sure your computer, your audio is on mute. Kasnander, can you make sure you, let's see. There, that was good. Whoever went on mute, thank you.
Perfect. We should be good to go now, Kelly. Subash.
Okay, so let's continue on, Mandy. Give it over to you.
Perfect. So as mentioned, everyone, here's the video that I feel is going to set the tone. Some messages from Senator Murray Sinclair, who was the commissioner and chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Hello, everybody. I'm Murray Sinclair. I'm the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the issue of reconciliation, something which, of course, is very important to us here at the Commission, but also is of interest and importance to a lot of people in Canada. One of the things that we at the Commission have discovered is that it took us a long time to get to this point in terms of the relationship between Aboriginal people in this country. 7 generations of children went through the residential schools. And each of those children who were educated were told that their lives were not as good as the lives of the non-Aboriginal people of this country. They were told that their languages, their cultures were irrelevant. They were told that their people and their ancestors were heathens and pagans and uncivilized and needed to give up that way of life to come to a different way of living. At the same time that that was going on, non-Aboriginal children in the non-Aboriginal school systems of this country were also being told the same thing about Aboriginal people. So as a result, many generations of children, including you and your parents, have been raised to think about things in a different way, in the wrong way, in a way that is negative when it comes to Aboriginal people. And we need to change that. It was the educational system that has contributed to this problem in this country. And it's the educational system, we believe, that's going to help us to get away from this. We need to look at the way that we educate children. We need to look at the way that we educate ourselves. We need to look at what it is that our textbooks say about Aboriginal people. We need to look at what it is that Aboriginal people themselves are allowed to say within the educational system about their own histories. In addition to that, we also believe that what's important when it comes to looking at the way that children are educated is to understand that because it took us so many generations to get to this point, it's going to take us at least a few generations to be able to say that we are making progress. We cannot look for quick and easy solutions because there are none. We need to be able to look at this from the perspective of where do we want to be in 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 generations from now when we talk about the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. And if we can agree on what that relationship needs to look like in the future, then what we need to think about is what can we do today that will contribute to that objective. Reconciliation will be about ensuring that everything that we do today is aimed at that high standard of restoring that balance to that relationship.
A little bit of context about the residential schools, kind of the background information as to why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created. Canada's vision was this: to kill the Indian within the child. Residential schools were an intentional effort by the government to assimilate Indigenous children who were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to live at the schools. These children were punished for expressing one's Indigenous culture and languages. Malnourishment, sexual and physical abuse, torture, lack of medical care, and neglect were common practices at the schools. It was a brainchild of Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1939. The sole purpose, as mentioned, to take the Indian out of the child. There were 130 residential schools. Approximately 150,000 children were forced to attend these schools. These were the only schools with graveyards. Many had barbed wire fences. Our communities were left without children. Social family dynamics were destroyed and forever changed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada concluded that residential schools were a systematic government-sponsored attempt to destroy Aboriginal cultures and languages and to assimilate Aboriginal peoples so that they no longer existed as distinct peoples. The TRC characterized this intent as cultural genocide. Every single one of your Indigenous friends are either a residential school survivor, a survivor's child, a survivor's grandchild, or all three. Every single one. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this is where we talk about recognition. It served two purposes: to inform Canadians about residential schools and their impact, and to guide Canadians through a process of reconciliation. It was established to oversee a process to provide former students and anyone affected by residential schools' legacy with an opportunity to share their individual experiences in a safe and culturally appropriate manner. The works of the TRC, including their videos and reports, are now housed at the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, which is located at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Manitoba. In order to support the reconciliation process, the TRC created the Principles of Reconciliation, which we're going to further explore, as well as 94 specific calls to actions, and they developed a reconciliation framework. The reconciliation framework consisted of 4 groupings. Each of the 4 groupings incorporates the 3 R's that we are discussing: reconciliation through knowing and honoring, reconciliation through good process, reconciliation through a healing relationship, and reconciliation through action. Recognition is where we see knowing and honoring, as well as action. Think of Stephen Harper's apology in the House of Commons in 2008, the announcement of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as Pope Francis' apology, and the creation of September 30th's National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. Respect is where we see good process. Again, the Truth and Reconciliation. Creation, your cultural capabilities within your own organizations, and bringing in Indigenous knowledge keepers. And relationships, the healing relationships, consider good process, as well as duty to consult, the free and prior informed consent, and your Indigenous social corporate responsibilities. And play another video. This is Prime Minister Stephen Harper's announcement of the Truth and Reconciliation, as well as his apology to former students of the Indian residential school systems.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. The government recognizes that the absence of an apology has been an impediment to healing and reconciliation. Therefore, on behalf of the Government of Canada and all Canadians, I stand before you in this chamber so vital, so central to our existence as a country, to apologize to Aboriginal peoples for the role the Government of Canada played in the Indian residential schools system. To the approximately 80,000 living former students and all family members and communities, the Government of Canada now recognizes that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions, that it created a void in many lives and communities, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that in separating children from their families, we undermine the ability of many to adequately parent their own children and sow the seeds for generations to follow. And we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that far too often, these institutions gave rise to abuse or neglect and were inadequately controlled. And we apologize for failing to protect you. Not only did you suffer these abuses as children, but as you became parents, you were powerless to protect your own children from suffering the same experience. And for this, we are sorry. The burden of this experience has been on your shoulders for far too long. The burden of this experience is properly ours as a government and as a country. There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. You have been working on recovering from this experience for a long time. And in a very real sense, we are now joining you on this journey. The Government of Canada sincerely apologizes and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly. The cornerstone of the settlement agreement is the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission represents a unique opportunity to educate all Canadians on the Indian residential schools system. It will be a positive step in forging a new relationship between Aboriginal peoples and other Canadians, a relationship based on the knowledge of our shared history, a respect for each other, and a desire to move forward with a renewed understanding that strong families, strong communities, and vibrant cultures and traditions will contribute to a stronger Canada for all of us. God bless all of you. God bless our land. Mr. Speaker.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada developed the principles of reconciliation. And then they believed in order for Canada to flourish in the 21st century, reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canada must be based on the following 10 principles. Number 1, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, commonly known as UNDRIP, is the framework for reconciliation at all levels and across all sectors of Canadian society. 2, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, as the original peoples of this country, and as self-determining peoples, have treaty, constitutional, and human rights that must be recognized and respected. Number 3, reconciliation is a process of a healing relationship that requires public truth sharing, apology, and commemoration that acknowledge and redress past harms. Again, thinking, knowing, and honoring, healing relationships. Reconciliation, number 4, requires constructive action on addressing the ongoing legacies of colonialism that have had destructive impacts on the Indigenous people's education, our cultures and languages, health, child welfare, the administration of justice, and economic opportunities and prosperity. Number 5, reconciliation must create a more equitable and inclusive society by closing the gaps in social, health, and economic outcomes that exist between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Number 6, all Canadians, as treaty peoples, share responsibility for establishing and maintaining mutually respectful relationships. Number 7, the perspectives and understandings of Indigenous elders and traditional knowledge keepers of the ethics, concepts, and practices of reconciliation are vital to long-term reconciliation. Number 8, supporting Indigenous peoples' cultural revitalization and integrating Indigenous knowledge systems, oral histories, laws, protocols, and connections to the land into the reconciliation process are essential. Number 9, reconciliation requires political will, joint leadership, trust building, accountability and transparency, as well as a substantial investment of resources. Number 10, reconciliation requires sustained public education and dialogue, including youth engagement about the history and legacy of residential schools, treaties, and Aboriginal rights, as well as the historical and contemporary contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canadian society. I'll play another video for you. This is an update from Senator Murray Sinclair on the progress of reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 specific calls to action.
It's been just over 2 years since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its final report and put forward 94 calls to action. CBC has taken a hard look at how far we've come and how far we have left to go on the road to reconciliation. Senator Murray Sinclair was the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner and wrote the 94 calls to action. I sat down with him and asked him if Canadians today were better informed about residential schools.
Absolutely. I don't think there's any question of that. I think the question, though, is whether they're more motivated than they were on the day the report was released. And because over time, the energy from events like that tends to wane and drop off. So I think among the public, the public still largely struggles with the question of what can we do about it.
I guess for people that maybe don't know anything about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how would you explain it to them?
So Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about giving a forum to the survivors and also to those who had worked in the schools to be able to come together in a process to address what had happened in the schools, but also what had happened in this country.
When you were writing the calls to action, who did you have in mind?
You, young Indigenous people, because I always said at that time in 2015, we were faced with a federal government that had already indicated that through their own actions, not so much through words, but through their actions, that they were unlikely to pick up the calls to action and do anything with them. And in the event that they continued in power, we said that we were writing this for those people who wanted the tools to be able to do something about this. And the phrase I used to use with the staff is that we have to write this for the reasonable.
I know that there's a lot of people that don't believe in reconciliation after Cormier and the Gerald Stanley verdict. What would you say to those people that feel like reconciliation isn't possible anymore?
Well, reconciliation is inevitable. I mean, you're always going to have a relationship with this country, with other people in this country. The question is, what kind of relationship do you want? And if you want to have a relationship of distance, then have a relationship of distance, but just know how to have it.
We've seen all of the headlines about Senator Lynn Bayak. What would you say to people who think that the residential schools didn't have that much of an impact on Indigenous kids?
Well, what I've said to her, and that is that the only way you'll know is to talk to them. and don't talk to them and then ignore what they're telling you and make up stuff, which is what she tends to do. It is about understanding them at a visceral level and imagining what it would be like if you went through that process, or if you can't do that, imagine what it would be like for your children to go through that process, and understand that the process of taking children away for the purpose of indoctrinating them into a different culture is inherently a negative process.
I know that there were criticisms about using the term cultural genocide instead of just genocide. Would you still use that term today?
Cultural genocide is genocide. You know, people need to understand that. And I would continue to use it. I don't think that there's anything wrong with using it. I think it has meaning. And it's more descriptive of what the process was really all about. The schools were not put in place for the purpose of killing the children. The schools were put in place for the purpose of killing the culture in them. And that's what we wanted people to understand. This process and other processes are all about too. The child welfare system does the very same thing because they fail to recognize the importance of that culture to Indigenous children. They think that there is no culture. They've convinced themselves of that without realizing, in fact, that that's a cultural value that they live with.
Only 10 of the calls to action have been completed out of the 94. How do you feel about that?
I'm surprised any have been completed, quite frankly. It's only been 2 years.
How do you think the government has performed in terms of their obligations in the calls to action?
The federal government? Well, they haven't performed very well. I don't think there's any question of that. I think we're beginning to see some change. And in my conversations with government leaders, I always said, you don't have a plan, and we gave you a plan. The TRC calls to action are a plan. Pass a royal proclamation on reconciliation, create a covenant on reconciliation, and invite the provinces and the territories and the First Nations leaders and the Métis leaders and the Inuit leaders and the church organizations, all of whom have contributed to this relationship, to sign the covenant on reconciliation.
What would you say to people who aren't sure of how to get involved in reconciliation? What advice would you have for them?
Well, I always tell them you're already involved, whether you like it or not. This is not an audience sport. You know, reconciliation is a participant sport, and they're already engaged. So the question is, how are you engaged, and how do you want to change your engagement? That's the real question. And when people ask me, what can I do? I will say, well, first of all, read the report. Read the summary, at least. I think it's a worthwhile endeavor. And if you can't figure it out after that, read the calls to action and figure out which one of those interests you or which one of those you can do something about. And then do something, because people who can should.
What makes you hopeful for the future?
You. And others like you, because you have an interest in making change. You have children, and your children will have children. And we believe in our children. We believe that we have an obligation to make change for our children. And that's what's key. As long as we have that belief in the need to improve the future, then the future will be improved.
So as mentioned, some of the things that you can do as employers and organization is to look at call to action number 92, which is your employer specific call to action. Recommendation number 92 asks the corporate sector and their leadership to adopt United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The Commission called for meaningful consultation, long-term sustainable opportunities from economic development projects, as well as the education and training for managers on the history of Indigenous people, intercultural competency, human rights, and anti-racism. They called upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt UNDRIP, United Nations Declarations on the Right of Indigenous Peoples, as a reconciliation framework, and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. This would include, but not be limited to, asking the following questions. What kind of education opportunities could be provided through online learning, instructor-led courses, and/or webinars? Where are your collective knowledge gaps? How will your response help your company to improve your Indigenous inclusion workplace performance and your engagement with Indigenous communities, people, and businesses? How will you position your company's response to the TRC report to achieve positive media and community profile? One of the recommendations that came out was call to action number 80. Call to action 80 called upon the federal government in collaboration with Indigenous peoples to establish a statutory holiday, a national day for truth and reconciliation, to honor survivors, their families, and communities, and ensure that public commemoration of the history and legacy of residential schools remains a vital component of the reconciliation process. This is where we came to September 30th. 2021 was the first day for National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The day honors the lost children and survivors of residential schools, their families, and community. The creation of the federal statutory holiday was through legislative amendments made by Parliament on June 3rd, 2021, known as Bill C-5, an act to amend the Bills of Exchange Act, the Interpretation Act, and the Canadian Labour Code to include National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. This is also the date that it received royal assent. Currently, the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is a federal statutory holiday. It only applies to federally regulated workplaces, which include organizations such as banks, airlines, and the post office. It is at the discretion of other workplaces how to recognize the day. Some provincially regulated employers may already recognize the federal holiday as a paid day for their employees. Both National Day for Truth and Reconciliation and Orange Shirt Day take place on September 30th. Things to consider for the 3 R's: recognition, respect, and relationships. Give your employees time off for reflection. Bring in guest speakers, those traditional knowledge keepers, to discuss their experiences in the residential school and how it has affected their families throughout the generation. Attend in-person events or digital events that are being offered throughout the day. There will be a 1-hour bilingual primetime show in partnership and broadcast on CBC, as well as Radio Canada, and APTM will be devoted to the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Programming is going to include presentations on the importance of the day, as well as cultural and artistic performances in support of healing and giving voices to the Indigenous peoples. APTN is also going to present a pre-taped sunrise ceremony featuring drummers, singers, elders, and various Indigenous traditions. As mentioned, September 30th does coincide with Orange Shirt Day. Orange Shirt Day is an Indigenous-led grassroots commemorative day that honors the children who survived residential schools and remembers those who did not. The day relates to the experience of Phyllis Webstad, as she is from a northern Shuswap nation, on her first day of school, where she arrived dressed in a new orange shirt, which was taken from her. It is now a symbol of the stripping away of culture, freedom, and self-esteem experienced by Indigenous children over generations. Orange Shirt Day is a legacy of the St. Joseph Missions Residential School, which operated from 1891 to 1981. Commemoration project and reunion events that took place in Williams Lake, BC, Canada in May 2013. The date was chosen because it is the time of year in which children were taken from their homes to residential schools, and because it is an opportunity to set the stage for anti-racism and anti-bullying policies for the coming school year. It is an opportunity for First Nations, local governments, schools, and communities to come together in the spirit of reconciliation and hope for generations of children to come. The annual Orange Shirt Day on September 30th opens the door to global conversations on all aspects of residential schools. It is an opportunity to create meaningful discussion about the effects of residential schools and the legacy that they have left behind. A discussion all Canadians can tune into and create bridges with each other for reconciliation. It's also a day for survivors to be reaffirmed that they matter, and do so and so do those that have been affected. Every child matters, even if they are an adult from now on. Understanding the current Indigenous population. We are at a current approximately 1.6 or 4.9% of the overall population found here in Canada. We've seen 42% growth over the last 10 years. We have a significantly younger population under 25. We've seen strong growth in the Métis sector, and 3/4 of First Nations individuals are status, and 44% of those First Nations individuals live on reserve. So in summary, we have a rapidly growing population. We are growing at 4 times the non-Indigenous population rate, and our populations are spread out amongst the provinces. Relationships. At its core, reconciliation is about relationship. The TRC explains that reconciliation means establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. Reconciliation is a process of being together in a new and better way. It is about healing the past and creating a new, more honorable future. It sounds easy, but it will feel confusing, complex, and difficult to figure out. It will be a hard, evolving process, but it can also be a beautiful and liberating process. Reconciliation is not about guilt, shame, or blame. It is about acknowledging the destructive systems and harm of our collective past. It is also about understanding how those destructive systems operate today, and then creating new systems, new ways of relating and understanding based on mutual respect. This means committing to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development and resource development projects. Ensure that Indigenous people have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Indigenous communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. Provide education for managers and staff on the history of Indigenous peoples, including the history and legacy of the residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties and Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Indigenous Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. Developing your relationships. Reach out to local Indigenous communities and organizations. They're a great resource of knowledge, and most are looking to actively participate in projects and create relationships. Invite members of the Indigenous communities to share teachings and stories. In many Indigenous cultures, learning involves observing, making attempts, and working through the failures. Our Indigenous worldviews consider learning and reconciliation a lifelong journey in which we have something to teach each other. And again, be mutually supportive, the free and prior informed consent. This promotes a mutually supportive environment for economic partnerships and resource development. One of the things that you can do as an organization is consider developing a reconciliation action plan, commonly known as a RAP. It is a strategic groundwork that enables an organization to support and advance the national reconciliation movement through deliberate commitments and leadership efforts. There are 4 stages of the RAP, and each type of RAP is designed to suit an organization at different stages of their reconciliation. A Reflect RAP clearly sets out the steps that you should take to prepare your organization for reconciliation initiatives. In successive RAPs, committing to a Reflect RAP allows your organization to spend time scoping and developing relationships with Indigenous peoples, companies, communities, and stakeholders. It's where you decide on your vision for reconciliation and exploring your pillars of influence before committing to specific actions or initiatives. This process will help to develop and produce future RAPs that are meaningful, mutually beneficial, and sustainable. An Innovate RAP outlines actions that work towards achieving your organization's exclusive vision for reconciliation. A Stretch RAP is best suited to organizations that have developed strategies and approach. They have established a strong approach towards advancing reconciliation internally and within the organization's pillars of influence. This type of RAP is focused on implementing longer-term strategies and working towards defined measurable goals and targets. An Elevate RAP is for organizations that have a proven track record of embedding effective RAP initiatives in their organization through their previous Stretch RAPs. Things we can do, 10 promising practices. Again, understanding the history of Indigenous populations and why reconciliation is important to them, why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was developed, focusing on their specific 94 calls to actions, respect Indigenous cultural integrity, and utilize the UNDRIP framework that they have provided. Again, as mentioned, you've heard Murray Sinclair mention it, actively participate. We all have a responsibility as treaty peoples. Reconciliation is not a prospector sport. You need to actively be engaged. Focus on call to action number 92, your employer-specific call to action and things that you can do as employers, managers, and supervisors to support the reconciliation process. And again, foster reciprocal relationships, relationships that are mutually beneficial. Reach out to your Indigenous friends and organizations and communities. Formulate your company's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. Commit to developing a RAP in the RAP phases. Invest in your company's cultural capabilities. And again, being an open and positive willingness to learn together. If you don't know how, reach out. Do not be afraid that we can learn together. And I'm going to now hand the floor over to Kelly or Subhash to talk about the upcoming offerings for reconciliation that we do have this September.
Super. Mandy, well done on behalf of, thank you very, very much. Folks, I think today Mandy took you through the 3 R's, recognition, respect, and relationships. But what she brought forward is voices. And when you hear the voices of people, it puts truth and reconciliation, or brings, I think, a different complexion to how it was started, why it was started. And it is a journey. I think the trajectory is something that all of you as employers can now take this back to your workplace. If you recall the Reconciliation Action Plan, we did a webinar on how to look at the Reconciliation Action Plan and align that with the 4 stages of the inclusion continuum. So if you're at that stage to actually start developing your own in-house Reconciliation Action Plan, you might want to go back to that webinar because it was a great resource and a great tool. All of you are at different stages, and I hope that this webinar has helped you say that, yes, we are going to look at TRC Call to Action 92. We're going to incorporate this into our management meetings, take it to the C-suite and into the boardroom to see how you can adopt it, implement it, and make it part of your reconciliation actions in 2022. I want to read to you a quote from Esther Jacko. This woman was quoted in the 1996 report on the Royal Commission. And I think as I listened again to the words of so many of the speakers through the videos, she had this quote about sharing voices. The human voice leaves a lasting imprint on human memory and feelings because so much heart and spirit can be communicated through the voice like no other medium. Esther Jacko from the Northwest Territories. So ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to a close. We are going to be having a session again on the 29th of September. And if you've got any questions and follow-up, email them to contact us at indigenousworks.ca. We will direct them through to appropriate people, Mandy, myself, Craig, Nicole, Paula, and be able to respond to any of the questions or issues that you see emerging, whether from this webinar or perhaps other programs and strategies that you want to look at implementing in the course of the next year. So do reach out, and we look forward to seeing you all again on the next Thought Leadership series. Thank you.